Hello everyone and welcome back to Anupam Tech Talk. Today we are going to talk about something that developers use all the time, but sometimes the difference between the two is not very clear. APIs and SDKs. What exactly is an API? What is an SDK? And when should we use one over the other? Let's understand this with some simple examples. Let's start with a very simple question. How does one piece of software communicate with another piece of software? Imagine we are building a mobile application and our application needs some information from a backend system. Our mobile application needs a defined way to communicate with that backend. That is where an API comes in. You can think of an API as a communication contract between two systems. So, what is an API? API stands for Application Programming Interface. In simple terms, an API exposes certain capabilities that another application can use. The important part is that the application using the API does not need to know how everything works internally. For example, if I am building a mobile banking application and I need to make a payment, I do not need to know how the payment system stored every transaction internally. I just need to know how to communicate with the payment API. Let's look at a simple flow. Our mobile application sends a request. The API defines how that request should look. The backend receives the request, processes it, and then sends a response. The application consumes that response. So, the important idea here is that the API acts as a contract between the application and the service. The implementation behind the API can change while the contract can remain stable. Now, let's come to the second term, SDK. SDK it stands for Software Development Kit, and SDK is more than just an interface. It can contain libraries, tools, documentations, sample codes, utilities, and other components that helps developers integrate with a platform or service. And an important point of an SDK can actually use APIs internally. So an SDK can make our app development experience much simpler. So what's the key difference between the API and SDK? Think about an API as a communication interface. We use it to talk to a service. An SDK is more like developer tool. It gives us ready-made components that can simplify that communication. So a simple way to remember API is that how do I communicate with the service, and SDK is what tools can help me build the service. Let's take a practical example. Let's say we are making payments. Suppose our application needs to integrate with a payment provider. If we are using the API directly, we might construct HTTP requests ourselves. We may need to handle request models, authentications, responses, errors, and other integration details. But if the payment provider offers an SDK, we might get a ready-made method and model that simplify much of this work. The SDK could internally handle things like networking, request formatting, and response handling. So the SDK can reduce the amount of integration code our team needs to write. So when would we choose the API directly? One situation is when we need a very fine-grained control over the request and responses. Another situation is when the SDK does not support that particular capability we need. We might also prefer the API when we want to avoid introducing a large dependency into our application, or perhaps we are building our own reusable service layer around that API. So, using the API directly is not necessarily better or worse. It depends on the requirements. On the other hand, when does an SDK make sense? If the provider has a mature and well supported SDK, it can significantly reduce the development effort. Instead of writing a lot of boilerplate code ourselves, we can use ready-made libraries. An SDK may also handle authentication, models, networking, and platform-specific details. This can gives developer a much simpler and more natural development experience. But there is one important condition. We should make sure the SDK is actively maintained and fits to our architecture. This brings us to the engineering mindset. I want to highlight we should not automatically say, let's use the SDK because it's easier. And we should not automatically say, let's use the API directly because it gives us more control. Instead, we should first understand the requirements. What capability do we need? Then compare the API and SDK. Look at the things like performance, security, dependencies, maintenance, support, and flexibility. And then make the decision based on the context. The best technical choice depends on the problem we are solving. Let's quickly summarize today's discussion. An API is a way for software system to communicate. An SDK is a toolkit that helps developers build the integrations. An SDK can use APIs underneath. Using the API directly can gives us more control, while an SDK can reduce the development effort and boilerplate code. And most importantly, we should not choose based purely on the personal preferences. We should consider our requirements, architecture, maintenance, dependencies, and long-term impact. And I will leave you with today's thoughts. Good engineers do not just use tools, they understand the trade-offs behind them. APIs and SDKs are just tools. What makes us better engineer is understanding why we are choosing one approach over another. If you find this episode useful, please like the video, subscribe to Anupam Tech Talk, and share it with someone who might find this useful. I'll see you in the next episode where we will continue exploring practical engineering concepts and how they influence the system we build. Thank you for watching.